Hey Silver Chips, this is Aviva and Grace, and we're going to go over page composition.
So this
So,
is
yeah.
kind of just how to think about your page when you're designing it, given your elements and text, etc. This is something that's going to have to be pretty dynamic. Oftentimes you're going to make a page draft before you necessarily know what the art and photo is going to look like. So just be sure to keep that in mind and be flexible, be willing to try new things later in the cycle. All right, so this is an example of a page from October cycle. You might recognize it from the What's Wrong with This Page assignment, although this one is much better with much less wrong with it. And we think this is a pretty good example of what we call a pancake page, which is a page with two stories where one is kind of goes all the way across the page on top and one is across the page on the bottom.
They're stacked on top of each other, yeah.
Yeah, which is why it's called a pancake page.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
They're a pretty common page design. But there are ways to do pancake pages well and ways to do them poorly. And so we kind of wanted to talk about what we think make this one a fairly effective page. So I think it really all comes down to the idea of balance, about balancing out elements and white space. So if you see, we have here, the Mulan art is on the left, and then at the bottom, the photo for the wedding story is on the right, which kind of gives the page some balance. You can see that's mirrored in the headlines with the Mulan headline aligned to the left and the wedding headline aligned to the right. That's not a strict necessity. We do highly recommend putting one element on one side and one on the other if you're doing a page, a pancake page where each story has one element. But you can do pages with two left aligned headlines. I would say just kind of look at it, try to make sure that white space is balanced out. So for example, right here, the white space is balanced pretty well with some up here on the right and some down here on the left. If you centered both headlines, you would probably be able to have fairly balanced white space as well. It's all about just play around with that and try to get the balance in. Here, I think that having one headline on the left and one on the right works particularly well because it really flows with the I think the movement of this art. If you look at the placement, this art is kind of looking to the right, and so it made sense to put it on the left so it's looking out at the rest of the page. And there's a lot of movement moving to the right, and so it felt right to me to have this headline moving, on the left and kind of extending rightwards, and then this one be opposite, especially because with this poking down, I felt that, I don't know, that
it needed, I think that if you put it on it would take away from the art. So I feel like, especially with art pieces that are kind of more dynamic and have a lot of movement, the goal is to have the art shine. And I'm sure we've stressed this in other videos, but this art piece is incredible, right? And you really want to have, of course, the story shine, but also the art. So we kind of think this page did a great job of showcasing the art and the story at the same time will make it a very balanced page.
right. And having this whole top area kind of flow rightwards. Speaking to balance, we wanted a bit of a flow leftwards. Of course, this photo being a square isn't quite as dynamic necessarily as this art, but having that headline starting on the right and kind of moving, leftwards, made a lot of sense to me just in terms of balancing out that movement and direction.
Yeah.
Um, and then you can see it's kind of nice with having the faces, this face looking rightward and these people looking leftward.
And this was
So
kind of just
that
like
is,
something that happened with this page. I feel like it's not necessary to have mirroring faces on pancake pages,
no,
but this is just
absolutely not.
something
That's
that
just
worked. Yeah.
something that, you get your elements and work with them, and these elements were lucky enough to really complement each other well. So I think that those are like the main concepts. I would say if you're having window quotes in your stories, especially if you're going to have one in each story, I would try to balance those out too. Maybe one on the right side of your top story and then on the left side of your bottom story, and try to balance vertically too. If you have one that's really high up in the top, you might want one further towards the bottom in the next story.
Yeah, and in this
Um,
page, there's no window quotes or other like special elements, but window quotes is another way to kind of add balance and make the page more unique. And I feel like with pancake pages, especially with two that are photo, which is kind of uncommon to have, but um, window quotes is something that really adds something to the page. So don't be afraid of using those, but only when it's necessary. Like in this page, if you had window quotes, it would be too busy. So
right.
um,
But
you
window
just have
quotes,
to, yeah.
it's kind of about directing the eye. So window quotes can grab your attention. They add a little bit more white space. And so they can definitely help you make your page a little more interesting, which is something that, you should all be trying to do. All right, but if you couldn't tell, really, the main principle is kind of balancing out all your elements and just playing around with placement of elements, with headline alignment, etc., until you get something that seems balanced. All right, so this is one really common way to do a page, I think, with one on top of another. Grace, did you have anything more to say about this page?
Um, Not really. I think this is a really, cool pancake page. A lot of, I'm sure if you go in our past cycles, you'll see a lot of pancake pages. It's usually an instinctual direction to go with, page design. So don't feel like you're constrained by the pancake page, especially if two 800 words and like two elements, right? So don't be afraid of, playing around with the elements, trying to figure out, but there's no shame in having a pancake page. So, but
Just try
just,
to make your pancake page feel balanced. Try to make your pages work with the art. And we're going to talk about now about another page option and why you might choose to go that direction with your page and why it makes sense for some pages.
yes.
So that is going to be the vertical layout. You can probably tell this page isn't quite as flashy as the last one. It's constrained by the fact that there is a much greater than average amount of text on this page, which does lead to having a text heavy page, which is okay. We're as design, we're kind of working with the elements and the text that we're given, and that's going to include sometimes more text than we might have liked us to see on a given page. And it's kind
Mhm.
of our job to work with that as best as we can in order to make it fit. So you can see this is kind of more of a vertical layout with this story right here going up and down, and then these two guest columns vertically on top of each other. And so I wanted to talk about why we chose to go with a vertical layout on this page. So the first thing I'm looking at is this art, which feels to me like a vertical element. There is movement on this art. A lot of art's going to have movement, and it's really important to pay attention to that. And to me, it looks like the movement is kind of vertical, with the people kind of holding their signs up in the air. And so to me, that says that it looks better in a kind of column format than it might on the
Mhm.
side of a horizontal story in a pancake format.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the second reason that this page worked better vertical, and this was really the driving factor and why we changed it, was the length of the guest columns. Had we gone with a horizontal format, likely this story would have been at the top, going all the way across for 5 columns with the art embedded in. And then those two guest columns side by side at the bottom. But the problem is on a 5-column page, which essentially all pages should be, unless we explicitly say otherwise, that means that one column would have to be that one guest column would have been 3 columns wide, and the other would have been 2 columns wide. And these, while this top one is slightly longer, were not the right lengths to fit neatly into that 3:2 kind of ratio. And so it just wouldn't have worked well. One would have had to be taller than the other in that horizontal layout, which just would not have looked good.
Yeah.
And the other option, of course, was having one be like 2.5 columns wide and the other being 2.5 columns wide, but that's kind of hideous.
And you never want to split columns
God, yeah, no.
ever.
So
Yeah.
this was worked much better in that vertical layout, where essentially where this line break was could just be moved up and down much more freely so that both of them fit well within the 3-column space. And so I think once we made that transition to vertical layout, there were a couple of things we wanted to think about. That first was dividing it up so it was readable. this is such a text heavy page. And again, I mean, that's working with the text that we have and the text that we need to publish, that we need to print, because we are a newspaper. So these lines help divide up the text, so it's very clear where each story ends and where the next one begins, which really adds some clarity to the page on such a text heavy page, and also helps add a little bit more white space. So you notice that there is a full pica between this line and the edge of that column and the line and the edge of the other column, and there's roughly that same amount of space between where the story ends and that line, and then where that line is and where the next story begins. And having that wider amount of space, that full pica, is really, really important. We have another video on how to do that, which I highly recommend you watch if you're going to use lines to divide your columns. And that it directs your eye and makes sure that you know where to go to read each story.
And I think in vertical layouts, they are not necessarily rare, but they do happen. And I think that with vertical layouts, using lines is a really important part of keeping the flow and dynamic part of the page. It can get very overwhelming to look at a page that's vertical, because sometimes, I mean, we read left to right, so it's easy to have, stories that go across the whole page. So I feel like the lines, especially in this page, really help section off where stories are and keeps it from being, super hard to read, which is the most important part about design. I mean, our job is to showcase the story and showcase the elements, but also make it able to read, because that's what our purpose is. We are a newspaper. We should not.
Newspaper is.
Yeah, a design should not.
Nice designs, but not at the cost of readability.
Exactly.
So the other thing I think we wanted to talk about on this page was element placement. So starting over here, I think it was very clear to me that this element had to go at the bottom of the columns. Why? Well, if looking at the art, the people are cut off at their torsos. So were it in the middle of the columns, they would look kind of truncated. Right? It makes much more sense for that part to be at the very bottom and then kind of moving upward with the signs.
Yeah, exactly. And I know we touched on this a little earlier about movement, and I'm sure we've talked about movement a lot, especially in this video, but you really want to have the movement follow the eye. So it would feel kind of awkward to have that piece of art anywhere else, I feel like.
Absolutely. Because this is vertical movement, it's moving up. And there's nothing to look at under it, right? With those bodies being cut off, you can't really put that in the middle of the text. And again, this is working with the art. This is taking the art and thinking, how am I going to put this on the page so that the artist's work looks good? And then the other thing was with these headshots, right? We talked a lot about balance. And so you might think, well, shouldn't there be an element on the right side? Because this element is all the way on the left. And my basic answer is yes, there should be, but it just wasn't logical to put either of these elements on the left. Right? With headshots, it generally makes sense to put them at the beginning of the story. And I think with this vertical layout and with this kind of mirroring this, because they are very similar, they're both guest columns, I think it made much more sense for their formats to mirror each other, rather than having something with one portrait on the left and then one on the right. I think it would have been very odd. And so, it made much more sense design-wise in terms of understanding what was going on the page to have both of these before the story began, right above the byline. And so, yeah, I would have really liked to see some more elements kind of over in this area, but that just wasn't really possible given the elements and the stories that we had.
And that's like a big principle of design, basically, which like we are just, I mean, design is the final part of, compiling a paper. We are dealt with the elements and with text. And we just have to figure out how to put those two together to make a really interesting looking way to deliver the information that we're, printing. So
Absolutely.
I think that in some cases, I mean, I'm sure this cycle you've seen kind of the news section, which is really text heavy, but all that stuff is really important to get out. So design did have to take like like a like take a back burner, like get kind of pushed aside as long as because we have to prioritize text getting pushed out. But when possible, um,
Mm-hmm.
design
It's all about
offers a great way to make the page and story actually sometimes easier to read.
right. And even on text-heavy pages, it's our job to make it as easy to read and as clear and as interesting looking as possible, kind of with some of those principles that we're talking about on this very text-heavy page. Right. It's about whenever possible. We don't ask artists to change their art. We don't ask writers to change their stories. I mean, it is very possible that some of you are sitting there thinking, oh, but you asked me to cut my story 100 words. And I mean, yes, there are rare exceptions where where stories just don't fit. End of story. Um, and so yes, on rare occasions, those elements are going to change, but we really try to minimize that and work with what we're given as much as possible. The one other thing though is that it can be collaborative, especially talking to art. And so if you, at the beginning of working on the design, talk to your artist, say, hey, what's your art looking like? What are you thinking? You might be able to, work your design around that, figure out where the artist is at, and make sure that you two are kind of working together to create something that's going to look really good on the page. And again, that just goes back to communication, which you probably think we harp on in every video.
But it really can make or break a page, honestly.
Absolutely.
So I just think, to kind of wrap up what this whole video is about, you want to just balance the page out with the text and the elements, and you also just want to make sure that you can actually read the story in a comfortable way. So you don't want to have it where the elements are kind of impeding on how the story flows. You want to have it all complementing each other. And that's our job as design. We want to have the story, the page complement each other. So I think that working with and playing around honestly with elements, text, not being afraid of taking a risk and kind of playing around. That's the wonderful thing with InDesign. You can literally spend hours just flipping elements around, shifting things picas by picas, figuring out exactly how you want the page to work out. But don't be afraid of, taking risks. But make sure
Absolutely.
that
And
it's
try
not,
things.
yeah.
You can always save a copy of your page, try out a new design, and think, does that look more readable? Does that look more balanced? Does that look more interesting? Is this going to catch my reader's attention better? Right? These are the questions that you should be asking yourself and that you should be experimenting with design in order to see the extent to which you can make sure that, yes, it is balanced. Yes, it is readable.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's all for this video.
Thank you all so much. If you
Yeah.
have any questions or you want us to look at, page drafts in order to say, hey, is this looking balanced? Is this looking readable? We're always happy to take a look, to do that, whenever.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, we're always a Slack away. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.